Thanks, Gil. If it's okay, I thought it might be best with what I had in mind to just kind of keep this as an open discussion. I didn't prepare any kind of presentation. Sue and John had asked me to just speak on my experience in the government realm as far as pursuing what is often considered environmental goals. But reading through the bios, it looked like I could probably learn more than I could share anything. So I thought I'll just talk for a few minutes and see if we can turn this into a discussion, because there's a lot to talk about. My background, I, like probably most people, never thought that I would be involved with government to any degree, but found myself getting sucked in. And I started as an architect trying to get a mixed-use building approved in a downtown Glenwood Springs, just down the road a little ways, and was really frustrated with the process. I thought that it could be done a lot better. I thought our building was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and how could they turn it down? So then I thought, kind of caught the bug, thought that I could change the world single-handedly, started volunteering. Through my business, I had a business, I called it Performance Building, where I consulted with architects and builders on efficiency and durability and things like that. Started working for different cities as a consultant. And then really thought that it was time to throw my hat in the ring, and ran for city council in Glenwood and was elected, and spent 4 years doing that. And through that, served on many other boards and commissions up and down the valley. And now I'm a staff member for the city of Aspen. I'm their global warming project manager. I think probably the only one in the country. Everyone is shocked at that title. But so now I'm on the other side. I was able to point fingers as an elected official and say, make it happen. And now I'm trying to make it happen, and it's a lot more difficult than I ever imagined it to be. My wife calls me an efficiency geek. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's lights or public process. I'm always trying to find the most efficient way to do things. And it's really been an education for me in the public realm to try and do that in a public process. And I realize the two just don't mix. It's like oil and water. And to have an efficient public process, you can improve efficiencies as much as you can, but to me it's a contradiction in terms, and that's been difficult for me to deal with. Especially now with the job, I essentially oversee the Canary Initiative, which is a local action plan to confront global warming. And the city, and I have to blame some of this on John, had really big ideas of what the city really wanted to accomplish. And I thought it was really great when I took the job, and still do, but I'm just realizing how complicated it is to try and bridge this gap of everything that you've been, from what I understand, what you've been talking about today. So now I'm charged with taking an issue like global warming, as you guys I'm sure have discussed today, incredibly complex, facts, figures, solutions, debates, educate the public. Well, first try to educate myself so that I can stay above the curve and answer questions intelligently. Continue to educate my bosses, and by the way, I have about 20 bosses. I have the Aspen Global Warming Alliance, which is kind of a think tank. John's a member, folks from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Randy Udall, folks like that. And then I have the city council, and then I have my actual bosses who sign my paycheck. So continually keeping them up to speed with what I'm doing, what they need to know, keeping that good communication so that they do what I'm asking them to do in various capacities. Advocate on a regional level. And there's a lot of different projects that I do in between to try and get the message across. And I thought when I took this job that the hardest part would be really making reductions. I mean, we all look at greenhouse gas reductions, and it's a little bit overwhelming where we need to go. So I thought, really, that's going to be the challenge. How do we do this? But in reality, and I found this when I was on city council too, the most challenging thing is communicating with people. It doesn't matter what the subject is, whether it be transportation, global warming, or potholes. Everyone has their own bias. And so to me, that's what I'm really learning. I'm getting an education in how to communicate better about this particular issue. And like I said, it's really no different. I think I disagree a little bit with a couple things that were just presented. I'm finding that it doesn't have to come down to money. And in fact, if it does, then we're in trouble. And I also think that, my personal opinion, I'm still kind of working this out in my head, but I wish the whole term environmentalism would disappear, because I really feel like we're alienating what I think we all would call quality of life. And in my business, I define it as redefining quality. So I would say we all know if we're going to build a house, we know exactly what kind of lights we want, we know what kind of carpet we want, but we don't know how that house is going to perform. Although I would venture to guess that to most people, when it comes right down to it, they do care. They want it to have good indoor air quality, they want it to last more than 10 years, and they don't want to pay an arm and a leg. So the issue is really for us to define our own, redefine what we typically consider as quality. And I think the same thing is true for all the different aspects of global warming and efficiency and renewables and all that. What we're really talking about is our own quality of life. I always use the example, I value the trees in the forest, but I do that for selfish reasons because I like the experience. And I wish I was altruistic enough to think that I just care about that tree. It's not really true. I really care about how that affects my quality of life and I have 2 young boys, their quality of life. And it seems to me that if we change that, similar to what Steve Jobs did in what was presented earlier, we're just changing the perspective a little bit. But if we just rely on money, I don't know if we're really there. So that's what I'm trying to do as I talk to citizens and elected officials and other communities is really change the perspective in what are we really talking about. And I spoke with Jeff earlier, and he said that one of the questions is do you have to change the message? And I think the answer is yes. I talked to well, just last week I went down to Telluride to present the key findings of the climate impact assessment, which John and Sue and Michelle just finished up for us. And I spoke with the Telluride Town Council, a very progressive group. They're on board. They had reduction goals, action plans. They helped contribute to the study. And the message was very different than the one I conveyed to the Mountain Village, which is primarily, well, actually I would say it's 100% second homeowners. Very, I don't know if conservative is the right word, but they're not the ones sitting around the table most of the time talking about global warming solutions. So the message was very different, and I had to frame it a little bit differently to sort of get their attention and to know that I'm not just a tree hugger, that I understand the values and the issues that they're dealing with as well. So that's been a big challenge for me. I think the other thing that is a struggle in government life is honesty. Not that people are dishonest, but it seems as if it's becoming so difficult to communicate with people that we tend to refrain from being as honest as we could be. And so these relationships are broken, and you know, I get in trouble if I didn't invite this person before I invited this person, and all of a sudden it's just a quagmire of egos, and I'm part of that. So I'm not pointing a finger at that, but I really think it's kind of at the crux of where we are today in society. And since the environment is becoming such a higher priority, I think it's something that we really need to look at. That we need to find a way to go back to honest communication, and maybe we'd be able to tackle these things a little bit better. That's really all I had to share in my initial concerns. I really was hoping that we could sort of discuss this more. You could ask me questions or whatnot, but I just thought I'd share a little bit of my own perspective. I'm sorry if it was too short or if I didn't provide enough, but I thought maybe we could just start talking from there. Again, I'm being selfish and want to learn more than I share. So.
Can you say how you try to frame it here in Aspen to take action on climate change?
Again, even here in Aspen, there's a lot of different groups. The Aspen Rotary Club, a lot of financial executives, and I spend most of my time talking about energy and saying, I frame it in a risk assessment perspective. Say, look, forget about the issues. Let's look at the risks that you face. And if you follow or if you pursue these solutions, Do we not lessen our dependency on foreign oil? You know, yada yada yada, and try and breach it from that standpoint. And sure, there's still some people who will say, well, you're just sugarcoating global warming. It's not a reality. But I think part of me wishes that my job wasn't global warming project manager and it had more to do with my title revolved around energy, because that's kind of the solution base. I try and focus on solutions. So that's what I might do to that group. To a citizens group, I may focus more on, like I say, defining quality of life and getting them to embrace that, to think about things differently. For elected officials, I really, I'm also kind of a policy geek, and I try and focus on finding the metrics, I guess, if you will, in government, which is the policy. What kind of policies do you have that ensure that you get what you want? So I try and encourage them to redefine quality in all the policies that they have. So now, one of the first things I did was implement an environmental impact, and here I am saying we should get rid of that term, but we included it in every memo now. So every memo that comes through, whether they're deciding on, you know, what color paint or major facilities, they know what the cost in greenhouse gas emissions will be. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question very well, but I think it's really important to tune the message to whoever it is needs to hear it, so that they can walk away and say, all right, that's what's the ball I need to keep my eye on, and that's what it is. And for every group, it's a little bit different. Yes.
Don or Dan?
Dan.
You mentioned that the difference that you had with the first speaker book is that it's not all about money. And you use the phrase that you think it's important to change the person's perspective. That's hard to do. I mean, I'm thinking of one of my first teachers about psychotherapy who said most people prefer the misery of the familiar than the anxiety of the new. So what, in your experience, have you found to be helpful to induce people to change their perspective?
That's so true. In fact, I have a slide with what I consider the two greatest obstacles, which is the focus on the short term and the focus on the familiar. And I think that's very true. I think I need to be clear that money is certainly a part of the equation. It's part of my decision-making process. It's part of everybody's decision-making process. And I think that's the short-term rationalization for that long-term redefinition or redefining of quality. But I think what I try and do is get them to find a new perspective through their familiar process. So maybe I need to talk to them in financial terms, but what I'm talking about and what I want them to grasp is completely different from what they're doing. I don't know.
Because it's been my experience for 25 years in the therapy room, and then trying to extrapolate how do we get a therapy of culture change, that people do not change for rational reasons. They change because they are affected at the feeling level. Right. You need the reasons, you need the facts, but it's something else that motivates a person to change. Right. And that's what interests me. I thought maybe you had some experience with that.
You know, I started off, before when I had my business and I'd give presentations, I always wanted to make sure that I had all the solutions in my presentation so that they could walk away and they knew that they had to go buy a compact fluorescent light bulb, they needed to buy an ENV, and so forth and so on. But in reality, to me, if people aren't inspired to change by the time they leave the room, then I didn't accomplish anything, because they can get all the other information wherever they want. So I think that's ultimately important. So now in my presentations, I have pictures of my kids and other people's kids, and because William McDonough, a very well-known architect, said, did you fall in love with your wife or your husband because they're efficient? You know, efficiency isn't what we want. We want this great quality of life. And the same thing is true for how we make our decisions. And it's a feeling thing. It just feels right. So I think we need to find that inspiration, that sweet spot to say, yeah, that just feels right. And that's where I need to go. So that's what I try and focus on. Oh, okay.
Actually, the question is something more like, would you describe your relationship with your partner as sustainable? Oh yeah, that was the line, right? He sort of said, "This is what's wrong with the word sustainable." It's like there's absolutely no passion in it.
Right. And try and describe it.
So yeah, oh, my relationship's sustainable. Sure.
Yeah.
This is a question for both of you, really. When you do the calculations and you look at the price of gasoline, there's a component that's usually left off, which is the price of the externalization, which is really the issue that we're discussing. How much cost is there to the piece that's not in the equation once it leaves the tailpipe? And there have been a number of people who discussed, as they had back in the 1980s and 90s, with the natural resources damage assessment, assigning a value and looking at the relationship between what comes out of the tailpipe and the value of the resource that's damaged. And I wondered if that comes up in your discussions, and certainly in your equations, that's something that is a significant savings that's not recognized with, it is recognized with your technology, but not recognized in your calculations.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why I try and keep cost out of the equation as often as I can, because explaining global warming probably would seem simple compared to explaining the financial benefit of the environment, as people have tried to do. And to me, it's just an impossible argument. So again, I frame it as a risk assessment. And let's not compete on a dollar standpoint, because I have no idea what kind of dollar value I can put on reducing global warming emissions. I just know that it's the thing I need to focus on. And if I do these things that are going to reduce my emissions, then I'm also accomplishing those things. So why not do it? And I can't qualify it, but there's a lot of things that, this is the same old argument. There's a lot of things that we can't quantify, but we do, or we can't bank on. We don't have homeowners insurance because we expect it. We just know that if we don't have it, we're in real big trouble. So I guess I don't even worry about what the costs are coming out of the tailpipe, because I know it's bad.
I mean, I think it's a real challenge to do, but I think you have to acknowledge them when you're trying to make a business case, and it comes down to it's a metrics issue, it's a quantified issue. You have this option versus this option, and you're talking to a CEO, and he has to make a choice. And I think it's good, and it's really important to frame the whole debate, but unfortunately, he's accountable to his board based on a metric of dollars too, and I think public policy is slightly different because people vote not necessarily on a dollars basis. That's not the metric of policy necessarily. It's important, but I do think you make a good point, and I'm not trying to show that it all comes down to dollars by any means. Don't get me wrong. I think one interesting example is hybrid cars, like the Prius, for example. All the American automotive companies made the case that it's not an economical technology. Right. You can't recoup the cost of the hybrid technology over the savings of the gasoline over any reasonable number of years. So it's not economical, so we won't do it. And so I think that's a good risk. It's a good assessment of that risk. And meanwhile, the Japanese said, it's just the right thing to do. We have to be stewards of our environment. We have to pay attention to the products that we create and we develop. It's the right thing to do, and that will ultimately pay off, and it has. And so I think you make a good point, and I'm making a case to support your point, which is, that the dollar metric isn't the most important, but I think it can be useful in trying to make cases and account for externalities, because it's just not fair. From my perspective, trying to make a case for something that's just more expensive, my instinct is to say, well, is it really more expensive? Because I don't believe that it is. I think it's more costly to society, to have this damaging effect.
And I think it frames the discussion about values. It doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily come to a conclusion, but it forces you into the discussion of the difference between cost and values.
And the only thing I would add to that is Amory is fond of describing pollution as waste. So if I was to make the argument to a CEO, I'd say, well, how much waste is acceptable? And by just allowing that waste to occur, they're just acknowledging that they're willing to throw money away. And that's oversimplifying it, but I think that's been a useful frame of reference.
I have a point to make in that when we were organizing this, we really expended some effort in trying to get a larger sector of the business community to come to this meeting, and we failed, in our attempts to get a larger community here. And so a lesson learned from that is we need to think, if we were ever to do something like this again, what do we need to do in a different way to entice more of the business community to come to a meeting like this? Is it possible? And if it is possible, how do you do it?
I mean, it's tough. I am in a lucky situation. I'm lucky because I'm in a situation where I can say this is worth my time and I'm going to go leave. But if I was, working at GM or something and had to make a case to my manager to go away for this week-long thing, I almost assuredly have to take that as personal vacation. It's hard to justify it. I think that it depends. I mean, if there was some, a lot of companies see value in publications, and if this maybe had a little bit more publicity around it, maybe that would have more value. I don't know. I mean, companies justify going to conferences all the time to present things and talk about things and listen about things. So I think just making it relevant to the business person's business, whatever issues that they're concerned about.
And it's interesting that the two sectors that I think we failed in, business and politics, it was extremely difficult. I don't know how many people I called in the political world that either wouldn't return calls, or if they did, showed very little interest in it. So, and yet those are the most practical, where the rubber hits the road.
Exactly.
Aspects to this problem.
But I think there's people from ecological economics who would have joined us, Dr. Stanza and a whole range of people working in that area, and also people from green politics. There's a lot of people.
Yes.
Who,
We're trying to get the other side into the room.
but ecological economics is part of the art. I mean, that cost accounting makes a difference. That global reporting initiative, as it is at the UN, is a new framework for cost accounting. In other words, there's a lot of people who can speak to what's happening and how corporate responsibility is not always just greenwashing.
If you had a different title, perhaps, but somehow you might have had success in getting business people in.
Like the future of fuel costs, for example. And then there's a mitigation strategy too, that efficiency can be helpful to them. But I'm amazed by even things like cost. I do government work too, and it's the job of selling energy efficiency is so hard, even though it's a bottom line savings. I think probably because it's so boring, people are just, they don't want to attend to it. And you have the enlightened ones, and there are a lot of them who do recognize it as a bottom line thing that's important to their business. And colleges and universities are keenly aware of energy costs now. They're really paying attention. But again, the metrics do become important because that's the parlance. And so you have to be able, as you said, present it in ways that really that hits the soft spot or hits that the pressure point.
I mean, what we tried to do in terms of selling, we tried to iPodify the fuel cell. I mean, we were starting with a fuel cell that no one's excited about, no one's interested in. And how do you make it interesting? And it's not about efficiency, and it really isn't necessarily about the metrics either. The most important thing is that when people see it or they ride it, they go, wow, this thing's amazing, I want one. It doesn't make any noise, it's cool, it's futuristic.
It doesn't make any noise.
No, I mean, fuel cells are solid state, so
Did you mention that as one of them?
I didn't.
That's a good one.
When we actually released the press release, the biggest response that we got, we were anticipating people talking about efficiency or hydrogen or no pollution. The biggest issue that came up was this thing doesn't make any noise. And it's just funny as an engineer, of course it doesn't make any noise, it's a fuel cell, but there were articles written that it was and we actually got complaints from certain organizations worrying about if people with disabilities that can't hear,
There's always some noise generator.
blind people.
It's amazing to me that you didn't list it, because we just somehow take the soundscape so much for granted.
I wasn't trying to necessarily make a full sales pitch, so I just
I think you need to make the fuel cells smaller than iPod.
that's
That'll be all
Well,
set.
they're doing it now for watches and for laptops.
I would just like to add, put in a little bit of psychology into the discussion a little bit, and I think kind of what we're really talking about is how comfortable are people in making cases for anything they believe in based on value or based on society's recognizable standards of money. And one example that came up during our preparation and talking about this was, I'll get the facts wrong, but one of the large petroleum companies was in an environmental lawsuit for several years, and the CEO of this company just kept fighting it and fighting it and fighting it. And finally, the environmentalists group pushed it so far that they won, and the oil company had to pay out a large sum of money to all of these entities that had been involved in the negotiations. And after it was all over, the CEO was interviewed by a journalist and was asked, well, how do you feel now that you've lost this case? And the CEO said, thank God, because it's the only way I could do it. It's the only way I could make the changes that I know in my heart were right, but I could not stand up and do it because of my shareholders. So that pressure, to maintain what is acceptable often goes against what one actually values personally. And to be able to take that stand out in the world is a psychological move. It's a requires internal reflection and some sense of bravery and some sense of insight into those two weighing forces within us as human beings with internal contradictions.
That's including the pictures of the family in your presentation. And then the state of Rhode Island did a greenhouse gas action plan. It's a wonderful plan, and how they presented it was in a little, multi-page brochure. But it was about families, and it was about going ice skating, and it was about going to the beach. And it was sort of, here's so and so, and these are the kinds of things that they like to do. And they're concerned about the environment, and then this is what the state of Rhode Island is doing, so that there's not only there's a direct message of connecting up the science and the impacts with behavior, but also just the gut stuff of it. Oh, I know that family, and it was like a little
story.
vignette about this particular family. So it's, we don't.
I quickly wanted to respond just really quickly. You were talking about efficiency is not sexy, and it goes to what this gentleman was talking about, the familiarity. I find with our staff, adding something else to their plate just turns me into a target. And it doesn't matter what it is. They may be, they may have the same values, but it's more work. So I think it's really incumbent upon us, again, redefining values in our policies so that it's just part of everyday life. And I need to go out and buy a boiler. Oh, wait, I forgot I have to buy an efficiency one. It's just I need to buy out the most efficient boiler, and then it's not more work. So.
I think that the iPod sort of solutions approach can apply not only at the consumption end, but also at the production. For example, in darkest Denton, Texas, where we have a biodiesel industries production facility, which is located on what we might, in a genteel way, call the campus of the landfill and the sewage treatment plant, or the wastewater treatment plant in Denton. They're powering their biodiesel off methane coming from the landfill, so that there's no energy input in the biodiesel process. And we've got an NSF grant application going now to convert algae, which turns out to be high in lipids, as a feedstock for the biodiesel, which will help the city meet its EPA requirements for reduced phosphorus and nitrogen, which doesn't come out of the wastewater treatment plant and goes into the reservoir. So there's a certain, not only efficiency here, but elegance in this system where you're using both landfill and wastewater treatment at the production end. And the politicians are interested in it because, so we've got them involved, and also the entrepreneurs who are doing the biodiesel. So in terms of involving people in the public sector as well as the private sector in energy solutions, this is sort of a nice little story that might work in other places.
And I think the telling of the story is so important. At Intelligent Energy, we did a lot of work doing similar things, trying to get different organizations to work together and cooperate. And we tried to get Toyota to put in fuel cell systems at a chlor-alkali plant using waste hydrogen, and do these complex systems because it just makes sense and it's elegant, and there's ways to capture the wastes all over the place. But it is hard because it boils down to each individual participant having some metric, and they've got to have some bottom line. And the only way to really get it to work, in my opinion, is if you do have a really good story and you get someone that's sort of a ringleader and sort of connected to everyone and can tell a story and get people passionate about it. Because it's too tough to just boil down all these projects to, how much is he paying for the natural gas? Well, what else could he do with the natural gas? And how else could he fuel his biodiesel burners? And, it's tough to do all that analysis, and it takes time and lots of cases and arguments. It's way easier to just tell a really passionate story and try and get people to buy in that way, but it doesn't always work in business because people want to know, well, how much am I saving by doing this? And cities want to know exactly how much pollution they're reducing. It's a great story.
Just two things. One to respond to Jeffrey's.
I mean, point you made earlier, you had trouble getting the business community here. The Oxford School of Business put on a conference in the spring on green business solutions, and Gore was the keynote, and they had 1,000 delegates from the business world, and they sold it mostly by putting on these big workshops on things like emissions trading, which all of my friends, all my green friends, on Wall Street and all, these guys, that's what they're aching to do, is get the U.S. into the emission trading market, and they're doing somersaults that, Britain and California now have this joint plan. So, I do think there's a lot of interest there, even though you might have some problems with this particular workshop. And the other thing I want to sort of to Dan's comment, it was really funny you mentioned the Rotary Club. I think this really can't be overlooked. A friend of mine named Tracy Stone Manning is head of something called the Park Fork Coalition in Missoula. And just north of Missoula is a thing called the Milltown Dam, and behind the Milltown Dam is one of the biggest Superfund sites in the country, and it's all the sort of the poison, that came out of the copper mining in Butte and stuff that flowed into the Park Fork River.
Cyanide leach mining.
What's that?
Cyanide.
Cyanide leach mining. It's just unbelievably bad stuff, and they've been fighting for years to try to have the dam removed and then contain the toxins, and then basically have sort of open up the river and then have a long-term cleanup. It's been very, very controversial because, when you do this, the river's not going to be usable for a long time. So she started working on getting the biggest possible coalition, and I pulled her aside at a party a couple of years ago, and I said, you guys really think you're going to do this, or are you just taking a position? And she said, no, last week, I knew we were going to succeed because I got $1,000 from the Rotary Club. And she was, I can tell you, she was doing somersaults down the street, so thrilled that she had actually built a coalition about an environmental issue that wasn't tagged as an environmentalist-only issue. And that was heartening. What was also distressing were further conversations I had with her that she got a lot of shit from this, from other people in the environmental community in Missoula, who said that she was, in bed with the enemy now. And I think that's the kind of thing that, I really appreciate your sort of position on this, because I think in the same way it's very much like Tracy, there just seems to be no way of getting to solutions, keeping that sort of us versus the model going like that.
And I think we're wrong if we think that these different sanctions or groups don't have similar views on life. They may be polar opposites on some, but I think when you find that, we're talking about apple pie and mom in most cases.
That's real pluralism that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Earlier today. I mean, it's not just pluralism at the level of metaphor, it's pluralism at the level of reasons.
Yeah.
That people are going to have overlapping interests that are completely different but get to the same conclusion.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm also interested in these places of controversy that, trying to split the environmental movement. For instance, Brooke, what you brought up about nuclear power and this big push suddenly to normalize it in our consciousness again that I see a lot of people now participating in it. And I think your idea about, getting, for instance, terrorism insurance front and center in the discussion, something I would like to see happening a lot more. At the same time, I'm very aware, I've just come from some meetings I set up in Norway, and they are grappling in a big way now with wind power generation. And probably everybody here is aware that that's also a zone of real controversy in various places on the continent where people feel like, but what, I moved here so I could be staring across the valley, and you've got to put up all these giant, and everybody, including, my brother Bill McKibben says, hey, that's ridiculous. If we want to save this planet, we got to be putting up these windmills. And so the folks, over in Cape Cod, the vineyard that don't want the windmills destroying their view, give us a break. We need to do this. And because I feel that our sensory connection with nature, the aesthetic, that is to say, I just think it's our most basic contact with the more than human world is via our senses. And so I just think it's very, very risky to belittle that and to think of that as something that's just secondary, and we shouldn't pay too much attention to how it's going to disrupt the sensory feel of where we live. I think that's a tremendous mistake. So I find myself now disagreeing with a number of very close friends on that in particular instances. And I'm just curious how, that's a discussion, a thread I hope surfaces again and again through the week, because I'm very interested in other people's sense of this stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. These types of situations come up a lot, I think. We did a lot of work in South Africa with the World Bank, and we actually were the only fuel cell company to win this big grant to, the idea, I think, is a good one. The idea is basically, you have rural Africa that doesn't have much electricity at all. How are you going to get electricity to them? Can you leapfrog current energy generation, power generation technologies in the same way that cell phones sort of leapfrogged telecommunications industries? And so the concept is good, but then we get down there and we're going out and talking to different companies and villages and things, and at some point we kind of stopped and we were like, are we just totally nuts? We're going to put fuel cells. We can't really get them in anywhere in the Western world. We're going to try and put them out and power these huts. This is totally absurd. And you kind of feel like you're selling iced Eskimos or something at some point. So we sort of backed away from it because we realized it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So we found that even in our own companies that you can get into these situations where you think you're doing the right thing and it seems to make sense, but then at some point maybe you have to realize that maybe it isn't the most appropriate solution. So I think your point is well taken, and it helps to be reflective in all instances. In the fuel cell bike, does that make the most sense? And I think it's good to continually question our assumptions.
And maybe, it's pushing us toward, it could push us toward sort of radical pluralism also in our sense of energy generation in different places. That each place, each bioregion, each small watershed may have, perhaps we can take this this big mindset of technology as big and begin to now shrink back and settle down onto the ground and finesse our technological know-how to adjust it to what would be most beneficial for this valley, which is different from the way they ought to be generating their power on the other side of this range.
This is like Schumacher, this whole
Sure.
beautiful.
Do you think it pushes us to eventually tackle some taboos? Like in this country, you can't talk about population growth. In this country, we can't talk about the capitalist system. We can't talk about economic growth. I mean, all of those things that property rights. I mean, there are a few, holy cows that we can't talk about yet, that haven't been part of the climate change discussion at all. I wonder if maybe that eventually will.
I think so. I mean, I can't imagine why any of us would have come to this unless we all have a sense that we've been bumping up against taboos, and the time is short. And it's time to, they have to be named, and we have to be able to push past them.